Here's to whiskey kisses, the peaty taste of sin.
Greetings, whiskey folk, and welcome back to Drinking Out Loud. This is a very special episode of Drinking Out Loud because, as you can see, I'm not alone. And this time, I'm not just, not alone in the sense that I've got someone else in the studio. We're going transatlantic here, or trans-Pacific, depending which way around you want to go. But welcome to the show, Stuart Baxter. It's an absolute pleasure to have you, sir.
Hey, Adam. Yeah, absolute pleasure to be here. Always nice to talk across the pond every so often. So, yeah, good to see you.
We're lucky over here in BC that the time difference works out really nicely with Scotland. So Stuart's just finishing his workday. I'm just beginning. It's good. We should take advantage of this more often, actually.
Yeah, meaning I could probably drink a lot more than you just now.
I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So today's episode, we're talking about a recent tasting we just did at the Dram Association. As some of you might know, we've just recently restarted doing in-person tastings. Of course, we've got new COVID-19 protocols, and it's all quite different to how they used to be. But for those of you who can't join us in person, we're still carrying on the YouTube videos. So although the tastings have already happened in person, we want anyone who's watching from home to be able to join in the fun as well. And you get the extra added bonus of having a co-presenter. So this works out well. So the tasting we've just recently had is the first of a new kind of tasting here at our club, what we call the Indy Spotlight. So a lot of you might be very familiar with the Indy Showcase tastings that we do, and they're sort of something we started that's kind of our alternative to some of the S&WS outturns in a sense, because our liquor store here has been an S&WS store for 5 years or so, and when we started wanting to bring in a bigger variety of independent bottlers, we wanted to showcase all of them. So we started these tastings where we try and choose 8 different bottlings, ideally different tastings from 8 different independent bottlers. And now this is the first time we decided, instead of doing a showcase, we're shining a spotlight down on one specific independent bottler, and that independent bottler today is Douglas Laing, and Stuart Baxter knows a hell of a lot more about Douglas Laing than I do, and he's in the right place for it as well. So why don't you introduce us to the concept of the company?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm in the sample room, which is effectively kind of my office, which is great. I get to spend a lot of time in here. As you can see the number of bottles behind me, and then all the samples with all the distilleries we work with across Scotland. So Douglas Laing is a company. We were founded in 1948 and are still an independently family-owned company in our 3rd generation. We were founded by Fred Laing Sr., now owned and operated by Fred Laing Jr., not so Jr., will kill me for saying that, who is our chairman, our owner, his daughter Cara and her husband Chris, who are now taking the reins of the company very much in the 3rd generation. So since 1948, we have been blenders and bottlers. And some of you might not know, but in 2019 in November, we took over our first distillery in our long history. So we're actually become distillers, blenders, and bottlers. So we took over a small distillery in Perthshire on the east coast, or in the east area of Scotland, and it's called Strath. So it's a micro distillery, and we're actually building a new distillery called Clutha, which is going to be located in Glasgow. And any more specific, I will get trouble from marketing and commercial. But we're going to be building in Glasgow and building a much larger distillery, which we're hoping to be in the next 10 months, so fingers crossed. But the kind of crux of who we are at Douglas Laing is as natural as it gets. That's what we do and what we like to kind of live by and work by. And what I mean by that is everything that we do is high or natural cask strength whiskey, no caramel colouring, so it's all natural cask colour from our whiskies, and non-chill filtration, which I'm sure a lot of people that you do these tastings for will be aware of, but if you're not, we allow the fatty acids, the esters, the proteins into the whiskey, making it as natural as it can be, basically as close to drinking from the cask as possible. And that's Douglas Laing in a nutshell.
Nice. I mean, the non-chill filtration thing is, people wear T-shirts saying, no chill filtration on the whiskey festival here. It's quite funny how people, really latch onto that one concept, because it's kind of an easy thing to understand. Like, why are you taking the flavor out? What are you doing? And I think texture really increases as well with chill filtration. When you let fatty acids and proteins in, flavor is one thing, and then there's an indirect attribute to chill filtration. You actually change the texture and the mouthfeel, which in turn will push flavors through, in my opinion. Absolutely. And I honestly have, I would very rarely add ice to the whiskey anyway, but the risk of my whiskey getting cloudy, I don't care.
No, exactly. And part of the reason that we do bottle at high strength, 46% being minimum for the remarkable regional malts, is allowing that. So in the change in temperature will not make the whiskey cloudy and that higher alcohol level.
Although I don't know if you've spent much time in some of the colder parts of Canada, but I've had a few whiskey deliveries in Ontario and over in Alberta, especially, where you get an awful lot of that. What's the term? Irreversible fluck, I think it is, where it turns like a snow globe. You get all the little globules of fat in it.
Still tastes good.
It's amazing how often that happens. Oh, it's beautiful. It's somehow better. You can see it's real.
Yeah, absolutely.
It turns every whiskey into a Blackadder raw cask. It's great.
I've got two friends that come from Canada, and they go and they visit their family regularly. Well, obviously not currently. And the pictures they send of me of just, boiling water into there and it turns to snow immediately. It's a very different type of cold than what I complain about every winter in Scotland.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember complaining about the cold when I lived in Edinburgh, but I mean, in fairness, my Irish folk singing housemate didn't believe in heating, so that didn't help.
Having ice on the inside of your windows. Put a jumper on, an extra pair of socks on, you'll be fine.
But out here in Victoria, it's not so bad anyway. We're very temperate. It's almost like living back in Yorkshire, actually.
Nice. It's good.
Yeah, it's very similar. Yeah, you should come over for the festival in a couple of years. It's a good crack over here.
I'd absolutely love that. Yeah.
All right. So the first whiskey we're trying here today, and we're actually trying 8 whiskies. Stuart's only got 5 of them because 3 of them are very, very small limited editions, but we'll still talk about them a little bit. But the first one we've got today, Stuart does have, which is good news. We get to drink together. And I nicknamed this one the Beekeeper's Windmill. And here's the tasting notes that came along with it. Garibaldi biscuits were always the beekeeper's favourite. She made her own from scratch, complete with an extra special ingredient, candied orange rind. However, she did secretly enjoy the odd dark chocolate Kit Kat too. Today, she decided to tuck into both whilst on her break, sat inside a dusty old windmill that milled the flour that she used in her baking. The top floor of the windmill is where the bees hid their hive. She collected raw honeycomb as the bees returned from their travels collecting pollen from nearby heather. The spring breeze brought aromas of fresh sage and the nearby brewery wafting through the windmill.
That is amazing. That is absolutely funny. So can I guess which one it is based on that tasting notes? Because we haven't done this. This is the first time I've heard that. Right. The start of it, I was wavering here, but I think it's that.
Ah, interesting. No, so we're actually starting with the Beastie.
We're actually starting with the Beastie, right? I'm amazed that you got the orange and honeycomb out of it. Because we talked about that dry area. That's where I thought this, because Gauldrons goes into that kind of delicate smoke. So we go for the Beastie.
Absolutely. Aye, the Timorous Beastie. And that's one of the beautiful things. Like, the whole point of whiskey is that every single person that's going to taste a whiskey is going to taste different things, right? These are just what I found. And that's one thing that, I don't know how familiar you are with the Scotch Malt Whisky Society's tasting notes. The reason they are so good is because it's a whole, perfect. There's a whole panel of them doing it, right? So it's the highlights from a bunch of different people. So you're getting a more broader aspect. These are literally just mine. Normally I would have 1 or 2 of my co-workers, but at the moment with, working remotely most of the time, it didn't quite work out. I'm hoping that at least one of the things I said will resonate with everyone that drinks this. I'm in no way expecting even half of them to actually get it.
No, I think the tasting notes were absolutely bang on. When you started talking about that kind of, was the dryness in it, that's what pointed me towards this, especially the biscuit notes that we always associate with Gauldrons. Because the honeycomb and orange, I completely see in the Timorous Beastie. It was when you mentioned, especially the dark chocolate, because I get more milk chocolate with Timorous Beastie. With Gauldrons, I get dark chocolate.
Okay. And that is actually something, every time you taste a whiskey, obviously it's going to be a little bit different depending on what you've had before or after. And
exactly.
I've often heard that a lot of master blenders will taste first thing in the morning because that's when the palate is most awake. So this is my first thing to drink of the day. Exactly. I literally haven't had anything today. So this is going to be interesting to see what I get this time.
My palate's ruined then. As you say, it's completely subjective. What one person will taste or will smell will be completely different to the next. I always say to people, you'll never be wrong. And it makes my job, part of my job quite easy in that respect, that being able to say, please tell me your tasting notes, because at the end of the day, if I just rhyme off, it tastes like biscuit, orange, fudge, or whatever, people don't necessarily remember that. Whereas if you develop your own relationship with the whiskey, it's far more powerful, but it's more of an educational side of it as well, which I really enjoy. But yeah, completely agree with you.
Nice.
So the Timorous Beastie anyway, Timorous Beastie is our blended malt. So one of the 5 categories of Scotch whisky containing 2 or more single malts is what blended malt is. No grain whisky in it. Timorous Beastie is our Highland blended malt, so containing only single cask, single malts from the Highland region. So most notably Glengoyne, where I grew up. I have favorite distilleries. Glengoyne, Glencleary, Dalmore. Some of the biggest distilleries go into this. And the 2 words that we use to describe it as a kind of crux are sweet and vanilla. So what you would expect from a kind of Highland classical flavour profile is what Timorous Beastie offers. Delicately spiced, loads of vanilla because it's 100% bourbon cask aged. And then the colour that you see from it is natural colour. And this is bottled at 46.8% high strength.
Beautiful. So we had a couple of questions from our attendees last week. So one of the big questions is, of course, the Remarkable Regional Malts is all about trying to capture the essence of a region. And as we all know these days, there's almost as many exceptions to the rule of regions as there are things that actually follow the rules these days. You know, you've got peated lowlanders with Ailsa Bay, you've got unpeated islas, of course, and you pretty much always have. So there's also the fact that it's very blurred lines as to where regions are, and there's always the argument that anything that isn't a lowland is technically a highland. So you mentioned 3 of the highland distilleries that are in this whiskey, but do you know from the rest of your from the rest of the components in here, which I'm sure if you do know, you're not allowed to say, are any of them, could they technically be part of another region? For example, like Glenfarclas will always describe itself as a highland, even though it's right in the Speyside. Do you know
Macallan as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Do you know if they're strictly going for, Highland whiskies that don't fit into another category as well?
No, I mean, I think the objective is it's a difficult one because regions are not legally binding, as you say. Macallan, Glenfarclas are 2 very good examples of people that say Highland when they are in the heart Speyside. The idea behind them is to achieve the flavour profile of the Highlands, and everything that we include within it is labelled as a Highland distillery. Having said that, Scallywag, our core, Macallan is one of the key incorporations to that, because Macallan itself is as you said, it's a traditional flavour profile, but now we have, Ailsa Bay peated, which is a lowland. And that's not a classical traditional flavour profile of the lowlands, what we would associate with a traditional flavour profile, whereas Macallan is a very traditional Speyside style whiskey, even though
absolutely
Highland Scotch whiskey. So to answer your question directly, yes, everything we put into Timorous Beastie is Highland labelled, and the flavour profile is to achieve a classical traditional flavour as we would associate with the Highland.
Nice. Makes a lot of sense to me. Beautiful. All right. Well, truth be told, and people at home have got to learn a little bit about where I work right now, but my parking lot is full and I'm using street parking. So I have a strict time limit on this tasting that I don't normally have. So we'll move on.
Keep me from rambling.
Well, keep me from rambling. I mean, most of the time when I do these videos, I aim for 3/4 of an hour and hit 2.5. So,
We'll be fine. We'll get it. We'll get it done.
So the next pair of whiskies, I'm going to give a little bit of a clue in advance. These are ones that Stuart doesn't have. And these are, I'm going to cover up the most big label. These are from the Old Particular. And this is an interesting thing because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the Douglas Laing company started doing single casks before they started the Remarkable Regional Malts.
Yes.
Series, right? And they started with the old malt cask, which, Family Feuds aside, is where they began. And the Old Particular is pretty much the continuation of that.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, as we said, we've been blenders and bottlers since 1948, and we actually originally started with a brand called King of Scots, which is up behind me. I can grab it, which is a blended Scotch, actually. So that was the actual start of it, was King of Scots, and since then we've developed relationships with over 65 distilleries now in Scotland, across all the regions. So, which is great for me. So we work with over 65 distilleries, and each of them we've bottled independently. A single cask bottling. So that was absolutely the beginning of it. And then we had, in 2009, Big Peat Core was the first of the Remarkable Regional Malts. He started it.
Beautiful. So I'm actually going to do something a little different. I'm actually going to read out the 2 tasting notes and then show you the 2 whiskies and see if you can tell which one might be which.
Cool. All right?
It'd be almost impossible, let's face it, because the whole point of single cask whiskey is that 9 times out of 10 you'll get something that goes against the distillery character, right? But these are the ones we've got. So number 2 of the tasting, cherry go round. Who doesn't love a good fruit salad? This one features honeydew, melon, pear, cherries, and banana, served with vanilla whipped cream and toasted crushed pistachios. All that fruit just feels altogether too healthy, though, so it's time to tuck into some naughty treats. You tuck into a Dutch apple round with rich buttery pastry and cherry cola ice cream float. And finally, a shot of thick, muddy espresso coffee as you pack a pipe with damp tobacco. There, that should balance things out.
Okay, I'm writing these down frantically.
Oh, nice. So the second one, we got tea time, and that's time spelt T-H-Y-M-E. When one visits the tea house, it's often tricky to figure out which fanciful baked good will go with which tea. Today's treat of choice is a lemon and thyme shortbread. So what tea should we choose? We've narrowed it down to Japanese barley tea, Moroccan mint and apple tea, or chamomile. The table next to us had no such trouble, as they tucked into ginger snaps and chai lattes. Now that's a winning combination. Then the answer struck you. It's not a tea at all, but rather a hot toddy of whiskey with a clove-studded lemon wedge and lashings of honey. All right, the 2 whiskies that we've got there are both space ciders. We have an Afrask 15 and a Tamdhu 18.
I recently had that Tamdhu 18 on my desk.
Ah.
Polished off quite quickly.
Yeah.
Is that a Ochroisk? Okay. Right, tricky. I reckon the Tamdhu is the first tasting notes.
It was a 50-50 and we went the wrong way.
Give up, I'll see you later.
That's quite right. Hey, it says all that does is confirm exactly what we were just talking about how tasting notes are so personal and how one person's going to get completely different things than the other. And it's also interesting because you're probably far more familiar with this Tamdhu than I am then, because I've only had maybe 3 half-ounce pours of this. So maybe you can tell me a thing or two from your memory banks of what you thought of the Tamdhu as well.
Yeah, no, I quite enjoyed the Tamdhu. Tamdhu is one of those distilleries you don't actually get a huge amount of access to. Of course, they're owned by Ian MacLeod, who have Glengoyne and Smokehead. But Tamdhu itself, you don't get much access to them through independent bottlers. It's mainly just the commercial, because they've only been revitalised in the past 10 years, not even. And start in terms of production.
I honestly couldn't even remember having one in the SNWS here, and that's, we get 8 different whiskies every single month here from the SNWS, so we go through quite a few distilleries. I don't think I've ever seen a Tamdhu. I might be wrong.
It's quite rare to see them. And Brave Ale, I think we had recently had a Brave Ale which we tasted. I think it's kicking about here somewhere. Hello. Look what I've just found. I thought I got rid of it. I've got a Tamdhu 18 right here.
You beauty.
Look
at that. Very nice.
But it's just one of those whiskies that you don't necessarily see very frequently, in independent bottlers especially.
Mm-hmm.
See, that honeydew melon that you'd mentioned with the Ochroisk, I believe you're talking about, that's what kind of hits me at first. Small like Jaffa cakes, orange biscuit. I always use certain words in tastings that I don't mean them in a negative connotation. Musty, like a kind of like a damp room, almost like if you walk straight into a warehouse, into a Dunnage warehouse, that weight of whiskey and warmth.
Exactly, and that actually comes up in one of the tasting notes a little later as well. And there's a thing we have in our club here that I'm sure is pretty universal: the whiskey asterisk. We have a tasting notes, and there's always an asterisk at the end, but in a good way.
Mm-hmm. Because there's certain things that you say, and you're just like, I mean that positively. Things like petrol, for example. Petrol smells nice, but it has a very negative connotation. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So yeah.
Mm-hmm. It might just be the fact that I'm not used to having, well, I say I'm not used to. I'm not too used to having alcohol early in the morning, but the Tamdhu has a ever so slight. I don't know how to really describe it. It's almost like the slight Listerine effect. It's not minty, but it's kind of refreshing.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean. Actually, the herbal note on it, on the nose especially.
And I think that's what I was getting through is at the thyme and chamomile on the first way through.
But what I love is, all of our old particulars are either natural cask strength or high strength. I think it's at 48.4. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And 48.4 high strength.
A perfect segue, because that was one of the questions that came up is, so with the move from old malt cask, which I know in the modern era has always been 50% ABV. I don't know if it's always been that way back when it was, under, Douglas Laing before the split. But it was always 50% ABV. And with the old particular, it seems that you have set ABVs that you aim for different ages and different styles of whiskey. So, for example, both this Tamdhu and the Thrust are both 48.4. But you'll see older ones at a higher ABV. You'll see ones that are more sherry influenced with a different ABV. Is there like a master spreadsheet that tries to decide what ABV everything comes out at, or is it sort of more done personally by sort of taste and touch?
Yeah, it's always done by taste and nose, and the reason being we've got two percentages that we aim for in the old particular range, 51.5 or 48.4. Now, normally, if it drops below the 48.4, we bottle it at natural cask strength because we don't want it going any lower. But there are examples. I've recently had a Blair Athol 21-year-old 51.7, and it was probably the best sherry cask I've ever tasted. I've given what I had left of it to my dad. Really regret doing that. I love him to bits, but it was a very good whiskey. The reason that we do it is Dave Broom actually talked about this very recently in the Whiskey Exchange Festival, if anyone had attended it. He talked about 46%, 48%. Alcohol's a carrier. It carries flavour through. The one example I always like to use is aftershave and perfumes. The reason it's an alcohol base is because it holds flavour and nose very, very well. And as much as it is a carrier, there is also kind of an optimum level where pushing over, you end up getting far too much ethanol, far too much alcohol in the nose, and leaving it under just doesn't carry through as much flavour as you would want. So 51.5 we would normally associate with your bigger, more oily new make spirits. Things like your Macallan's is a very good example always of a thick, oily new make spirit, and sherry cask influence, where you've got your more meatier, deeper stone fruit flavour profiles. And then the 48.4 you'll normally always see with more refill hogshead, bourbon cask aged, and it's an experience thing. I love the idea of a master spreadsheet where it's like Macallan Sherry 51.5, but it is along the lines of Cara, Fred, Chris making a judgment call and saying, right, that is going to be great at this percentage. Let's bring it down to that. In that example of that Blair Athol that I had, it was just a case of that's great as is, bottle it, get it in. So yeah. That's the justification behind the percentages.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. There's such a huge push for cask strength everything these days, and it feels a little over the top quite often. But there is a large, and I think much quieter, but just as big population of whiskey drinkers that don't want cask strength all the time, or really any of the time. I've got one really high profile customer who, is one of these guys that stores an expensive Macallan in his desk drawer in every office he has across the country, kind of thing. And he hates cask strength whiskey. Like if ever I put something to him that's like, even if it's the rarest, most interesting thing in the world, like, and it's cask strength, no, I'm not going to drink it. He doesn't want the pressure of having to add your own water and, making it or ruining it. He just wants something where you can crack a bottle open, pour it into the glass and drink it. And
I completely understand that. I completely understand that. The one thing I would say, and the right way to drink whiskey is the way you want to drink it. The best whiskey in the world is your favorite whiskey. I'm completely an advocate for that. You do what you want with your whiskey. The one thing I would argue for cask strength whiskies, and we're talking, I'm assuming we're talking about 58%, 60%, these big, scary percentage levels. And the one thing I would argue is that with a lower percentage, say a 40, 42%, what we see more commercial bottlings, at a certain point, they've brought that percentage down on the bottling line. And what actually happens is the congeners, the flavour profiles are popping off. You've got that lovely exothermic reaction. That happens there as opposed to in your glass. And I think, as you say, people have this pressure to drink cask strength whiskey at cask strength. And I'm no. I'm always one, personally, the way I do it is I'll have a sip of it as is, and then I'll add water, little by little, a little bit of water. And then what happens is, especially if you cover up your glass, you'll see the reaction. It increases by 1 or 2 degrees. You actually end up with a little bit of humidity in the glass. But you also end up with a lot more flavour popping up. And I completely get the amount of times I've just wanted to crack open a bottle, pour it and drink it. and not have to think about that. And I have bottles for that. I also have bottles for experiencing as well. I completely understand that point of view, and I agree with it wholeheartedly. But you've also got that other side of just it's something a wee bit special. You get to control it. You get to dictate how you drink it, and don't let anyone else dictate how you drink it either.
Absolutely, yeah. And on that point, just talking about ABV as well, like I have no issue with a 40 or 41, 42% whiskey under certain circumstances. I mean, one of my favorite whiskeys that really got me into whiskey was the Black Bottle Blend, and that's 40%.
Nice.
I think it might be 43 now. They might have changed it, but still, there's nothing wrong with that under certain circumstances. But also for much more higher end whiskeys, for me, it's not really about the ABV. It's more about the difference between the bottling and the cask strength. Like sometimes you'll get a whiskey, for example, that came out of the cask at 46% and then got presented at 43. And that's hardly, technically they watered it down a little, but it's hardly anything. Whereas if you get some of the whiskeys, like a lot of the younger whiskeys that will come out at like 62% or something ridiculous, if you water that down to 40, that's going to be a massive difference in the flavor, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, completely. It's just one of those things that it's demand, and it's completely subjective. People like different things. As you say, one of my absolute favourite whiskies was Glengoyne 15, sadly discontinued, but still got a couple of bottles sitting in the house, one to drink and one to just stare at. I think that was commercially 40%. Absolutely brilliant dram. Absolutely brilliant dram.
Yeah. I find it interesting, though, I don't know if you've realised this, that there's quite a few whiskies that actually have different ABVs in different countries. Like there's a lot of, especially Lefroy, I think, is one of the big ones, where Lefroy 10, I think, is slightly lower in the UK than it is in North America, which I always found interesting.
Yeah, I lived in India for 2 years working with Pernod Ricard in their single malts portfolio. And India has it's like a threshold of percentage, and I think it's 49%. I might be wrong. I think it's around that. But we had the Glenlivet Nadura, which was, as natural as it gets. It's cask strength, all that jazz. It was cask strength in every other country that permitted it. But in India, it had to be brought down to underneath that watershed of alcohol. So it was still high strength alcohol, but it wasn't natural cask strength. So yeah, absolutely, I'm aware of that. It was a bit of a killer when I was getting buy-in natural cask strength whiskies. Because as much as I love experiencing all whiskey, there is that level of category as well that you want and you crave sometimes.
Yeah, it's also like just on a little side thing with ABV and countries' laws. Have you ever come across the funny thing in Australia with their ABV?
No, I've not actually.
They're legally allowed to call it whiskey. I think it's 37.5.
Not Scotch.
Not Scotch, no, but whiskey, which means that one of the most popular whiskies in Australia is Canadian Club, of all things. So in Canada, Canadian Club is, of course, 40. If you go to Australia, it's 37.5. It's really weird.
I can get X amount of bottles out of cases, I'm sure, with reducing it at 2.5.
So I've always wondered, technically, when that's exported from Canada, that's not whiskey.
Yeah, technically.
It's magically becomes whiskey somewhere in the Pacific.
Love that. The labels just magically change like Jumanji.
Beautiful. So this was our delve into a little bit of Speyside. Obviously, the Scallywag would normally be in a lineup with you, and we don't have the Scallywag on the table right now. But I definitely look forward to having more special edition Scallywags coming my way, especially as it was one of my girlfriend's favorites. And it's not just the dog, but we have the cask strength Scallywag at home that I will occasionally steal a dram from her bottle.
Yeah, it's an absolute, we do so many limited editions across, because we've got obviously the crux, which is the remarkable regional malts, which is the traditional flavour profile of each region. But then we go on massive tangents and just explore what we can do with things, as you say, like the cask strength Scallywag, that's 100% sherry cask, whereas the core is 75% sherry, 25% bourbon, to make it a bit more approachable. And that's at high strength, 46%. So it's just weird and wonderful. One of my favourite, quick segue, I know your car's waiting, I don't want to take it too far, but
it's all right, I'll just charge you if I get a parking ticket.
That's absolutely fine. The Rock Island Sherry was one of my absolute favourite sites. Rock Island's our maritime island blended malt, but the Rock Island Sherry I fell in love with. It was just a Willy Wonka of a dram.
Yeah, the
completely different.
Feis Big Peat a few years ago that was in sherry was beautiful as well.
Yeah. So we do weird and wonderful stuff, but the crux of it is that natural as it gets and traditional, but then we just go mental with other bottles.
Sometimes off the wall, yeah. Which is actually a good segue to the next whiskey. But before we move away from the single cask, there was one other question on the single casking that I thought we'd put to you. So the question, I mean, I'm sure it's like choosing a child sometimes. You can't say which one's your favorite. But in the back end, there's probably, we figure, a little bit of more focus on one side than the other between the single casks and the vatted malts, which are your two main focuses right now. If you have a beautiful cask in the warehouse that is just absolutely stunning, what would be the first thing in the company's mind? Would it be to release it as a single cask under the old particular label, or would it be to base a special edition remarkable regional malt on it?
It's a number of factors there, because I mean, looking at the Epicurean Cognac, which we'll come on to, there was only 400 odd bottles of that released. And, if we've got something in mind where we're like, okay, we're going to do Epicurean Wood Series number X, there's a really good cask, that would work great for it, then we might introduce it to that. But on the other, I think if we were blanketing across and saying we don't have anything planned and we're very much sticking to the remarkable regional malts and single cask, we would more than likely release it as a single cask offering. And then when we look at our exceptional single casks, we go from Premier Barrel, Providence, Old Particular to Extra Old Particular, then XOP Black, where we find very, very lovely Port Ellen 40-year-olds that I'll never be able to afford. So again, it just depends, because, when we look at our Old Particulars, for example, normally the age range for single malts, because we've got single grains within Old Particular, our single malts will range from maybe 13, 14 to up to 20, 25. But sometimes, we've got Talisker 9 behind us. That's an exceptional Talisker 9-year-old. So we're like, right, well, let's bottle that under Old Particular. That's a stunning, stunning cask. So, when we come across a cask, it's also, how good is this? Is this going to go into Old Particular? Actually, this is actually good enough to be an XOP. So there's a number of factors that come into it. But blanket, it's just a case of the liquid. Yeah,
that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the particular examples that they were thinking of, the customer that asked this question, was actually one of the guys that bought. I think we only got 3 or 4 in the entire province, and we got them all of the 33-year-old Big Peat. And they're like, I mean, it was an amazing whiskey and fantastic value. Like, surely if they'd have just released, there was probably 3 casks or something that went into it, they figure. And, surely if they just released those 3 casks separately as single cask offerings, they could have made a whole lot more money. I mean, it's an interesting conundrum.
Yeah, I mean, obviously in Scotch whiskey, the number in the bottle is the youngest whiskey in that bottle. So there's probably potentially some nicer or older whiskies. I shouldn't say nicer, because that's not true, as I'm sure we all know.
Actually, one of the worst whiskies I've ever had in my life was a 47-year-old Glenfarclas. Nothing against George. I love his whiskey normally. I don't know if it just went bad in the bottle or what, but old does not necessarily mean good. Absolutely
not. The best whiskey is your favourite whiskey. That's it. Completely. Age doesn't always mean better. But the 33-year-old Big Peat it's the oldest Big Peat we've ever done, and it's just good fun, and especially when the fact we find casks. And talking about the whiskey industry as a whole, you'll find casks and you go, that's great, but not for bottling. You know what I mean? You'll come across one and go, that is nearly perfect, but I wouldn't bottle that in a single cask bottling. And then you find another cask, you go, that's also good, but it's not quite single cask material. And then when you realize you can actually marry them together and create, holy, this is much better than those individually. Blending in itself is creating something that's greater than some of its parts. It's achieving a flavor profile that you would never be able to achieve with a lesser choice of casks. And I think that's where everyone gets this perception that single malt is better than blended, and it's rubbish. Neither one is better than the other. They're different categories. Blended Scotch, arguably, as a category that I always like to call it the big fat baby of the 5 categories. And that has the potential to be the most diverse flavorful out of all 5 categories. It takes from single grains and single malts and all these different casks. You've got a wider pool of flavour to take from.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's at the end of the day, it's just different techniques to try and get the same end goal of like a beautiful flavored. Yeah. All right. So the next whiskey we got, I called this one Tangerine Tagine.
Brilliant.
Fusion cooking can be very hit or miss. So when the cooking show contestants said they would make an East Asian Moroccan hybrid dish, all eyebrows were raised. Dried apricots, smoked paprika, and chickpeas made for a traditional start to the tagine, but the addition of tangerine segments, mango pulp, and desiccated coconut made it a unique experience worthy of a thumbs up from the judges. The next contestant to make it through to the next round did so with an impressive and creative dessert, Gulab Jamun, which is an Indian milk dumpling, in a rose water and spice rum syrup with charred pineapple chunks.
Oh, Gulab Jamun.
Was something...
I love Gulab Jamun. I was responsible for a few kilos when I was over in India.
Yeah, I discovered that for the first time when I lived in Edinburgh. I worked at a small little folk music pub called the Royal Oak, just on Infirmary Street off the South Bridge there, and we had one of the best Indian restaurants in town next to us, Mother India, and their Gulab Jamun was just stunning.
It's amazing, right? It's the most one of those perfect desserts. Yeah. Do you illustrate these tasting notes?
Do I illustrate them?
Yeah.
I can't draw for shit. Sorry.
I'd love to see you, because all I've got is these images in my mind. Just great tasting notes. Brilliant.
No, I'm a graphic designer, but I'm not in any way an artist.
Give it a go. Be great. I'd love to see the comic strips for these tasting notes. Now, the richness and intensity that you've described for me would push into the Gauldrons again, but the fusion side of it, I'd go with Epicurean cognac cask.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah. And I think the fact that you keep going back to the Gauldrons, as we will see when we get there, is the amount of complexity and depth of the Gauldrons means that they pretty much fit into any category, right?
It's just that richness,
Exactly. Yep, Epicurean cognac cask. And this is where I have to make an awkward admission to you. So always, I've been a big fan of Douglas Laing since I discovered them, decade ago or so. And I've always loved the remarkable regional malts. I mean, mostly because it's the perfect example that goes, it's the exception that proves the rule in a sense. Because I've always said that regions are pointless. And this is the exception that proves that rule in a sense, the remarkable regional malt series, where they're not saying that all Speyside taste like this, but they're capturing somehow the zeitgeist, the idea in people's heads of what a Speyside should be like, for example, and capturing it into a bottle and putting a dog on it. It's brilliant. But I've always thought the Epicurean was the weak link. That's entirely just a personal thing for my own preference in whiskey, but I've always thought the Epicurean was somewhat lacking. And then last year I was helping Stacey in doing a pouring for Douglas Laing up at one of the festivals in the North Island. And one of the things I got to pour, which I was slightly worried about, was actually one of the Epicureans. And I can't remember the exact edition. It was the one that had the Glasgow cone on his head, I think. It was the cast.
Yeah, I've got him behind me actually. Yeah.
And that completely changed my mind as to what Epicurean, could be. I don't know why I liked it so much more than the original, but I did. And then trying this one last week, that's the one, yeah. Beautiful. But then trying this one last week, it changed my mind again in a crazy tangential way as well. And it reminded me of some of the bigger names in lowland whiskies, which you can only assume probably made their way into this malt. There's only a few that you could really choose from.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's any Auchentoshan in this one, but I'm generally not an Auchentoshan fan. People have heard me many times say I don't. It's not that I don't like it. I actively dislike the Auchentoshan Freewood. There's something about it that doesn't work. But one of the best lowland whiskies I've ever had was an official bottling Auchentoshan. It was a 27-year-old Oloroso cask finish, and it's like, oh, that's what the lowland style whiskey really does well with, in my mind, is it takes on the wood flavor really, really well if you let it and give it something interesting to do. And that is exactly what's happened here. This is a mad whiskey.
Yeah. Just to touch on, I would agree with you to a certain level that the Auchentoshan is the weaker of the six. And the only reason, the Epicurean, even the only reason I would say that is that if you're a whiskey drinker and a regular whiskey drinker, it's a lowland classic style. So it is a lighter style in comparison to the other five. But what we've actually done is we've tweaked the recipe now. So we actually have a slightly different recipe moving forward with the Epicurean core.
Interesting.
Which is good. So we've actually introduced a touch of sherry into it. So you'll actually, if you've got a previous bottle, you'll be able to see that.
You don't have to confirm or deny, but is that because Bladnoch is more, gettable these days?
No, not at all. Not at all. I think we probably concurred with your thoughts in that respect. But the Epicurean itself, and again, you've touched on exactly what I was going to talk about, is that we introduced Auchentoshan, Glenkinchie into the Epicurean core. But as you touched on it, is that it is the most versatile of the six. Absolutely. This can lend its hand to just about either any cask, also within the mixology side of it, any drink. You can work this into an Epicurean and tonic, and it does work. Whereas if you did that with a big Peat, can't imagine.
It'd be a bit weird.
Yeah. So, actually, that's on you go, sorry.
So this is part of a series, right? And I don't know, because we only get a fraction of the special releases out here in the wilderness. Is this like at the beginning of a series, or are we just catching on at the end of a series now?
No, in the beginning of the series, I've got the Reef Salt cask behind me as well, which I've really fallen in love with. It's the Epicurean Wood series, and the objective is that we've gone round and found casks all over the world. This is the objective, that we're going to be finding unique oak casks globally that's permitted by the SWA, and obviously we're getting more and more of those every year, which is great. And what we're just trying to do is venture and find what we can create with a versatile spirit in different casks. So this has been finished. This is a cognac. I think this is the first one. This is our cognac finish. This is only 402 bottles that we actually did this. And it's actually a marriage of two casks with the Epicurean recipe in it. So it's cognac finished, and immediately you see, if you've ever had Epicurean before, if anyone has, you'll see the coloration difference between the Epicurean core and then a slight orange tinge. I don't know whether that's an immediate connotation in my head of cognac being orange, but there is a darker twinge to it because of that finishing.
Well, it's probably, cognac, I think has to, by definition, be in European oak to mature, doesn't it? So that would mean that this, a lot of the color is probably simply from the fact that it's European, not American oak for the finish. Yeah,
absolutely. Quercus robur. Absolutely. And you can see that in it. You can see that influence, but it's just, it's more unique. It's just a completely different side and face to the Epicurean. And as you say, it's just a bit, it's not taking that versatile spirit and putting it into something that's really going to take the flavor from it.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'm a big fan of what's happened with here, and like as soon as I tried it, I was like, I wonder what's coming. I wonder what else is available. I wonder what's coming next in the series. And like, I don't know if you know what's coming up, but I asked our attendees for a couple of things that they'd like to see the Epicurean finished in. The two biggest ones were they'd love to see what happens if you put Epicurean into a peated single malt cask, like an old Lefroy cask.
Nice. Cool.
Which would be kind of a cool mix. And that stems from something that's it's relatively popular these days in quite a few different places, but one of the local single malt distilleries, Shelter Point here on the island, have a release they call Smoke Point, which is exactly that, unpeated whiskey in a peated whiskey cask. It's just beautiful. And I think they're quite right. I think the Epicurean would do quite nicely in that. The other one, which of course is a new thing, a new toy for the Scotch whiskey sort of category, is of course the idea of a mezcal cask potentially. Or a tequila cask.
We had our I'm not allowed to say anything. We had our brand plans where we discussed what our plans were for each of the remarkable regional malts in our new site for our distillery, which was a really good news story. I'm being very careful not to mention exactly where it is. So we actually discussed the Epicurean Wood series and what's going to be coming up in 2021. Not going to say any more, but yeah, some interesting thoughts that were down.
Nice. And I just love the experimentation that people are doing with casks these days, and it's brought out a playful side to a lot of much more traditional companies. I mean, yourselves, but Scotch Malt Whisky Society as well are doing some crazy things. They had a blended malt with an IPA cask. And like, if you look at the SNWS 10 years ago, you would have never thought that they would do something like that.
No chance. And I agree with you. It's becoming a lot more. The whiskey industry is becoming a lot more inclusive as a whole. And you're seeing this, and I don't like to say this word traditional because we're no longer in that kind of function, right? This traditional idea that whiskey, or a small drop of water, and that's how you drink it, and you drink it at Glencairn, and you have to be 65 plus to drink it, and all this. It's like, no. And what we're doing is more fun. Yeah, exactly. You need elbow patches. It's not that. It's becoming more inclusive, more approachable for people that, I've got friends that don't like whiskey, and then I've given them a Rock Island Sherry or something weird and wonderful. And they're like, that's not whiskey. It's like, yeah, it is actually. Like, it's, I firmly believe there's a whiskey out there for every person on the planet, and they
Absolutely.
just haven't found it yet.
And that's one of the things that we describe our whiskey club as, and I'm sure I must have read it on the back of a bottle somewhere, but we describe ourselves as a club for exclusive whiskey, but we're an inclusive club for exclusive whiskey.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what it's all about.
Yeah, and there should be no snobbery around whiskey. Whiskey's there to be enjoyed by everyone. If you want to put it into a cocktail, do whatever you want with it. It's your whiskey.
Yeah.
The amount of times I've been in pubs and guys come up to me, the way you drink that whiskey is a wee bit of water. And they're like, mate, I've been working in the industry for a wee bit now. No, go away. Leave me alone.
Yeah. There are certain ways where, if you want to get deep down in the technical side of sampling whiskey and trying to get the most flavors out of it and understanding a whiskey, whiskey, quote unquote, should be drunk. But that's that's not particularly enjoyable in most cases. I mean, it can be, and that's what a lot of clubs do. But if you're just sitting to enjoy a whiskey, for God's sake, have it however you want. Like,
when you go, sorry, apologies.
That's quite right. How I got into whiskey, again, was at the folk music pub back in Edinburgh. And we had, it's how I got into Black Bottle. Several of our folk musicians, they drunk Black Bottle. And what they did is they got a triple, because that's what was legally allowed at the time. And they got it served in a pony glass, a third of a pint, and then topped it up with water. So it was basically like drinking a small beer. And they just sat and sipped on that all night. And the reason they did that instead of drinking beer, they said, it was because as a musician, beer made them too gassy and they didn't want to be burping halfway through a song.
Ah, perfect. So they just get absolutely trashed instead.
Yeah.
Play much better music as well. Thing is, that's funny you should mention that. I used to I was a manager of a bar in Dundee, and we used to have this bandits that used to come in, and they'd just drink pints of Guinness all night. And I was like, in a lager. I was like, no, bubbles. All right. I hadn't really thought about it. Okay, that makes sense.
Beautiful. So this, unless you happen to have one tucked away in the back, this is going to be the last of the ones that's on the table in front of you here. We're going now for a different old particular. And one of the things that might catch people's eye straight away is the darker tube. And I have a theory as to what the darker tube means, just from the ones I've seen. But is there an actual reason for the darker tube? Does it signify something?
I don't want to reveal, too early what category it's coming under. Am I on the right line?
Oh, so it is a style. Okay, good.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if it was a style. I assumed it was a style thing, but I also haven't seen any old particulars of a higher age, and I wonder if it might be an age thing, like anything over 25 or something.
No, it's single grain. It purely just distinguishes that it's single grain.
Excellent. So this one we called Welcome Home, and this is probably the most personal of the tasting notes. After a long time away from home, sometimes you just don't know which comfort food to dive into first. Sticky toffee pudding has always been a favourite, especially the way Mum makes it with the burnt toffee bits that stuck to the pan. Or maybe spotted dick, decadent dried fruits and rich sponge cake covered in thick vanilla custard. You know what? After so much time away from home, why not just have both? Mum's always happy to see you and has cleaned up the house nicely for your return. The table's been polished with orange-scented wax and there's a touch of ginger in the air from the new scented candles. Welcome home.
Oh, I see the crispy sticky toffee pudding sections in the side of the pan. That brought back memories. Those were the best bits.
Oh, absolutely. Those were the best bits. And it didn't quite seem as poetic when I was writing it. So, I was making it feel all holy and everything. It wasn't actually my mum that got that. That was school lunches, school dinners.
You definitely came from Yorkshire.
Oh, aye. So this is, actually, you can help solve a thing for us, because I've been told by different people the different ways to pronounce this, and I've now been told by someone apparently used to work nearby to it, the actual answer. So is this Cameron Bridge or Cameron Brig?
Oh, you know what? It's just one of those things.
Right. Well, the explanation I got from someone who worked on the rail line. The explanation I got from someone on the rail line was that the distillery is Cameron Bridge, but they once released a whiskey called Cameron Brig that was two separate words. And from that point on, the whiskey was known as Cameron Brig, but it came from Cameron Bridge Distillery, which is about as convoluted as you'd expect from the region.
Yeah, so it is technically Cameron Bridge, but for colloquialisms, Cameron Brig.
Nice.
And it is a colloquialism, it's slang, Cameron Brig. Either way.
So it's just based on how well you know them.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a formal thing. Nice. Yeah, it's a beautiful single grain. I don't know if you've had this particular edition.
No, I've not. I mean, we've got a couple of Port Vendasses behind me, which is a closed version, or closed single grain distillery, of course. I've not had a Cameron Bridge in a few weeks, actually, in the sample room. We've just had about that much left of a bottle, and we polished it off between a couple of us. It's horrible working here.
I know, right? Yeah, so this particular edition, one of the things that really stood out and one of the reasons I was really drawn to it was the cask type. This is a refill butt, which I think for older grain whiskies is the perfect thing. I mean, as much as there's a huge trend over here, at least for, full-on sherry bombs, people love their first fill sherry butts right now. I think, especially for an older whiskey, something that's spent more time in there, a refilled sherry butt just brings off this beautiful balance of the influence of the cask's previous inhabitants, the influence of the actual cask itself, and the whiskey. Yeah,
and especially with grains as well. Grains, I think, always need that. It's funny to say that I've got a 15-year-old pound, but I feel grains always need that 21, 22 years old maturation to kind of really come to form, because they can be troublesome, let's say, younger than that. And I agree with you. A first fill sherry butt is great when you want a sherry bomb, but I would always put a single malt into a first fill sherry butt. I wouldn't put a single grain. I think it would be far too intense, especially if you're pushing it up to that 22 year. If you want to age it 12, 15 years, then go for it, have a big. But I agree. I think a refill sherry is a very good cask or single grain whiskey to go into.
Yeah, absolutely. One question that came from this whiskey, which I think was a good question. Obviously, being in very much in the blended malt game, you probably get the name Compass Box mentioned quite a lot. And one of the things that made Compass Box, really popular from the get-go, their first ever whiskey was actually not a blended malt, but a blended grain. Was there any consideration when coming up with the idea for the lowland, for what became the Epicurean? Was there any consideration to maybe doing a blended grain?
With respect to the Epicurean, I don't know whether we'd made a decision. It was blended malts. I think once we'd started with Big Peat and when we got Scallywag in, we kind of ran with that blended malt concept for each of the regions, because I think everyone's quite comfortable with, or everyone knows the flavour profile of commercial bottlings from each region, whereas single grain is one of those hidden wonders of the world. People don't drink single grain, and it's an absolute crime because they're absolutely stunning, and you can pick them up such a reasonable price compared to the single malts, and they're stunning. I love Compass Box. Hedonism is a really good one. They've recently brought out their 20th anniversary. Compass Box did an amazing job. I think it's bold, but completely right to start the blended grain. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. And if anyone doesn't know, you're 5 categories Scotch whisky: single malt, blended Scotch in the middle. Blended grain is a category of Scotch whisky, and then single grain. And blended grain, the only one I know of is hedonism. That's it. But to answer your question directly, Epicurean, we didn't, as far as I know, and I don't think we would have considered a blended grain, but it's not to say that we wouldn't consider that in the future at all.
I know it was a bit taboo for a lot of people because they didn't want to feel like they were copying Compass Box for a while, but there have been a few pop-ups since then. I think Cadenheads did a Cadenhead Creations blended grain maybe. But there was also, if I remember correctly, wasn't there a special edition famous grouse, the white grouse maybe, that was a blended grain? Or the snow grouse or something?
So I know the naked grouse is a blended malt, but I don't know if I know which one you're talking about. I don't know if it's a blended grain or not.
Yeah, it never came to the market over here, so I never actually tried it. But yeah, I have a vague recollection that they tried it once, but it's not around anymore.
No, but as we talked earlier, it's opening up. It's opening up the Scotch whisky industry. Everyone's trying new things, and there's no reason for another whisky company couldn't do a blended grain. Absolutely not.
Totally. And the funny thing about grain whiskey here, which I found interesting, obviously within our club, people have really latched onto it and they know how and why it works and what's good about it. But for the general consumer that maybe isn't quite as geeky as club members, I find it bizarre how they will happily spend $500 on a bottle of Pappy Van Winkle, which is essentially a single grain whiskey from America, that is, 12 years old or something. And in my mind, rubbish. I hate old bourbons. I think the fact that it's in a virgin cask for that long just completely ruins the whiskey. But then they'll turn their nose up at spending $200 on a 28-year-old single grain, and it's like, what? It's mad.
I think perception has a lot to do with that. Like Scotch whiskey, single malt Scotch whiskey is, you hear those words and you think, oh, that's the best of the best, and regardless, anywhere you come in the world, if you come from Scotland as well, you think that is the ultimate. And I think it's just a case of people understanding and educating and going through this process, because you're completely right. Yeah, if you can't make rye whiskey in Scotland, it's not possible. Rye whiskey in Scotland would classify as grain whiskey, right? So you can make rye whiskey, of course, but you couldn't call it rye whiskey. I completely get you. And then there's the brand name comes into it, and a number of, but it's people's perception. I think it's just a level of education that comes with it, an understanding of, yeah, you're right. It's a 35-year-old Cameron Brig. Gonna get that instead of the 12-year-old single grain. And the one that you're drinking is a single cask, single grain. That's an individual cask. Which
one of about 600, I think, being a butt.
Yeah, because I always talk about
626,
which is quite good for a refill butt at that age, to be honest. That's pretty good. I always talk about whiskies themselves. So single malt or commercial bottles. Let's take Talisker, the first one that came to mind. Talisker's a family, and it produces a spirit from that individual distillery. And that spirit I always like to call is the family bloodline. So you can put Talisker's blood or Glenfarclas's blood into a number of different casks, a sherry butt, bourbon, hogshead, whatever you want. Those are individual casks, single casks. You can still blend them together and produce a single malt from Talisker. Single malt, single grain are technically blended. A professional courtesy, we talk about marriage of casks, but they're technically blended. The only true form of individual cask is single cask whiskies. And then blended malt is, say, Glenfarclas and Talisker, casks married together. So that's two different families. Casks themselves are like family members. You can hate one and love the other. They look different, they sound different, they taste, nose, everything's different with them, but they're all members of the same family. They share that same new mix spirit, bloodline from that same distillery or same family. I think that's a really easy, nice way of explaining casks, because some people don't quite get it. They say, single malt, it comes from one cask. Like, no, it doesn't. There could be thousands of casks in that batch.
Yeah. And I would probably guess that almost all of your remarkable regional malt series are technically going to be less blended than some of the things like Glenfiddich 12, for example. There's probably a lot less casks going into them.
Purely volume. We're not producing the same level of volume as whatever. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, you actually have a larger pool. If you go from a single malt blend, you can only take casks that were produced from that one distillery. Whereas if you get into blended malt, you can take casks from any malt distillery. And, blended Scotch, you open it up even more. You can take any casks from any grain and any malt distillery. And that's what I said earlier, is blended Scotch has the potential to have the widest range of flavour than any other category of Scotch whisky. And that goes down. So then you talk about the skill level that's involved in that is just amazing. There's no computer that can create these flavours over and over and year again. But it's people. And that's where it becomes a true art form. And that's what makes it so beautiful and so romantic is how amazing that talent really is.
Absolutely. And I've often described blended malts, and the reason I really like them and maybe even have a personal preference over single malts, to be honest, is exactly that. Like a single malt has only got so many flavors, or, look at it in a different way. It's an artist that can only use so many colors. As soon as you open that up to many more, you've got a full palette of colors ready for you. Yeah. And add grain into the mix, and you can also use a spray can too. Why not?
Yeah, exactly. And it's it's down to the blender, the master distiller, what have you. It's down to their talent that produces the final liquid.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So next up on the docket, we have one I called Cavern Camping.
So I think it's a very appropriate name, if I'm not wrong.
So this is you can tell that I do the tasting notes in the order because they tend to get a little weirder towards the end, and it's not just the addition of peat, which is really just bring on the whiskey asterisk. But okay, has your camping trip been cancelled due to torrential rainfall? Do I have a solution for you? Why not try Cavern Camping? Picture your old-school canvas tent in one of our luxurious limestone caverns and marvel for hours at how a place that seems so dry can smell so damp. The best part? With a cave this big, there's plenty of ventilation, so you can cook your porridge on an open fire. We even have barrels of birch syrup aging in the cave, which you can help yourselves to. Book now to avoid disappointment.
Oh, please illustrate these. These are great. Absolutely brilliant. Cavern Camping as a title is perfect. Gauldrons. Gauldrons literally translates into Bay of Storms. So yeah, I have since trying this for the first ever time, I have always considered and still consider this to be the most bizarre flavour profile I've tasted and smelled from a Scotch whisky. And I'm not saying that just because I work here and paid to say nice things. It really is bizarre. It actually noses, I would say, closer to a rum than your traditional concept of even a blended malt Scotch whisky. It's wonderfully bizarre. So yeah, Gauldrons are Campbellton blended malt. So it's single cask, single malts from the Campbellton region, which of course is, by this number of distilleries, the smallest region in Scotland.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'd be shocked if I was wrong, but I would say it's a fairly safe bet that there's a decent amount of Glen Scotia in this. And that is one thing that I love from Glen Scotia is how absolutely off the wall their single casks are. And I always think it's a testament to their blending ability there that they manage to make like consistent, cohesive-ish. I mean, they've got a lot of batch variety in their single malts, but the fact that they end up making something that makes sense as a single malt brand out of their single casks, which I've tried hundreds of now, and they're just nuts.
Yeah, they're mad. I completely agree with you. Campbellton's one of those flavor profiles, and as we talked about, regions don't necessarily matter anymore. But it's the flavor that they get from Campbellton has kind of stood the test of time as a very unique profile of Scotch whisky, I think. The way we describe this, the two words, is biscuity and oceanic. But the one thing I really love about this, I don't know about you might be completely different, but on the nose, I get the kind of the syrup that you talked about. I get caramel, biscuits. I don't know if you've ever had those like caramel waffles that you get in the Netherlands, and they kind of pull apart.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? Stroopwafel, I think.
Stroopwafel, yeah.
But that's the nose I get. But I don't get any smoke or peat at all on the nose. It's not until I take it into my palate and that explosion of flavour that I really get the smoke intensity from it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Blanche. Good morning to you.
Good morning. So there's one cheeky question in here, and this stems from, I don't know if you're aware of the rumor that was spreading around the internet at the release of the first Gauldrons, which, by the way, Gauldrons, the batch one, when we brought it into our store, I put it in a blind Campbellton tasting, and it was hands down the highest scoring whiskey in the entire lineup. I mean, we don't get much, unfortunately, from the Campbellton region available to us here in BC. For example, fair enough. It beat out the Springbank 15 and the Glen Scotia 15.
That's amazing. I know,
like, I think
Springbank, Glen Scotia are amazing.
Oh, absolutely. But there was a big rumor going around, which, you know, I made sure to tell people it wasn't confirmed, but I did possibly help stoke the rumor slightly, that, you know, Springbank and Glen Scotia, they've been on record to say they don't really like each other that much. And, you know, there's a lot of history between them. That kind of makes sense. Apparently, they used to have in their contracts that anyone who was buying a cask for blending purposes would not blend it with the competition's whiskey, so that you would never have Springbank and Glen Scotia in one glass. And the rumor has it that Gauldrons Edition 1 was the one to break that after several decades.
Okay, so I cannot confirm that either, because I didn't and don't know that at all.
Yeah.
The one thing I would say is that they both feature in the Gauldrons, definitely. And the other thing I would say is that distilleries also now sell whiskies and casks underneath pseudonyms, effectively, you know, under different names. So maybe, and I'm speculating as well here, but maybe that has helped void that fictional or potentially fictional contract. But what I can confirm is that both of them feature in the Gauldrons, definitely. Nice. But whether that's just hearsay, it's a nice story. Be nice if it was true. It'd be a great it'd be a great selling point for me.
Right.
But I do not know.
Cool. The other question, of course, do you know whether this is a three-way dance? Do we have all three in here, or is it just two of the three?
The batch 4, yes, all three. I know there was a batch where we just used 2, and I'm pretty sure Springbank didn't actually feature in one of them. But I can't say for 100%.
Which batch are you drinking right now?
I'm drinking batch 4, which I can imagine you're probably drinking as well.
No, I'm batch
5. Three. Nice. So interesting. So we're now on batch 5, which is now hitting shelves.
So, I mean, we're always one of the last places to get anything out in BC. It takes so long for everything to get here, which is a blessing and a curse, because it means that sometimes we're the last place in the world with something that's quite sought after.
Money.
But the difference between batch 3 and batch 1, I actually have batch 1 just behind the camera there, because I really, really, really like batch 1. And don't get me wrong, I like batch 3 as well. But batch 3 has this ever so slightly lactic acid note in it, which I didn't find at all in batch 1. And I'm guessing that batch variety, and probably the reason you actually put the batch number on these, is because of how crazy and off the wall the casks that you get from Campbellton are. Yeah,
and there's also it's now not, but it was a semi-limited edition for us. So we only used to bring this out, I think maybe twice a year in the same batch. But it was to make that complete distinction between this is the first batch, but this is the second batch, because, at the end of the day, there's only 4 distilleries technically, 3 big ones. Like, well, you know what I'm talking about. It's a nightmare when we've got like Hazelburn and Glen Scotia in the same place.
Whiskey within whiskey.
Yeah. They're not producing a huge amount. So the amount that we get, we weren't able to create a consistent member of the Remarkable Regional Malts, which now we can, which is great. So Gauldrons is very much part of the Remarkable Regional Malts as a permanent SKU, let's say. But it wasn't. And yeah, you're completely right. It was distinguished because the casks we were getting were wild. But not just that, is that we were getting varied batches because of that, which is part of the romance, I think, with Scotch whisky. It's just, oh, great. You'll be able to sit with batch 1 and 3 and go, oh, it's the same profile, but the specifics are different, which I love.
Absolutely. All right. Next up, the name will definitely give away which one of the remaining 2 this is. This one we called Old Fools and Rock Pools.
There you go. Done.
Every so often, it's nice to go back to the places you loved as a kid. When some old childhood friends came knocking after so many decades, you just had to take a trip down memory lane one last time and take a stroll past down the old beach path to the rock pools. Just like the good old days, you brought chocolate-covered salted licorice and a bag of dried blueberries for the walk. As you sat and reminisced around the beach fire, you passed around a pewter hip flask and a pipe full of tobacco, just like you did as teenagers. Now, being responsible adults, however, you remember to douse the embers in seawater before you leave.
Nice. Very resemblant of Rock Island.
Yeah, and here's a blast from the past for you, because, like I said, we still have some old stuff.
Yeah.
Which oyster.
Which I'll talk about as well. We talked about choosing between your children earlier. Rock Island Core is my favourite, personally. But the reason that we changed from Rock Oyster to Rock Island was purely, a lot of people don't like oysters. I personally adore oysters. Me and my dad, I think, have a bit of a problem. We absolutely love them. But it's quite a polarizing profile, especially when I start talking about, salty and briny. People get put off with it. So we changed it to Rock Island. So it was a bit more of an approachable name, let's say.
Yeah. And from a branding perspective, I completely understand that. The one argument that I've had put to me several times, though, which I kind of agree has some logic to it, is I think the kind of people that don't like oysters wouldn't like this whiskey.
Yeah. I have had examples where people absolutely adore this and they don't like oysters.
That's good to know.
So it does happen, but I would agree with you. It is for me, we spray this on oysters. I spray this on oysters. It works because it is that it cohabitates in terms of flavor profile, but it also adds in a level of sweetness, like a level of lemon citrus. I think for me, this is the broadest spectrum of flavor. This time. Yeah, for me, this is like the broadest spectrum of flavor for me, as I said personally, of the 6 RRMs. And it's quite clean on the nose.
It's all in my tasting notes, but yeah, it's very lemony on the nose this time.
Yeah, Power of suggestion. It's a great thing, isn't it?
Aye.
Amount of tastings I've been at, it's like orange. You're like, yeah, oh my God, it's orange.
Good Lord.
But it's the one thing I love about it. And it's a very similar thing when we get into the Big Peat, is the nose is very fresh and clean and slightly briny and slightly smoky. But then again, you take on the palate, it's this explosion. And I think this is what you find with high and cast strength whiskies, is that real intense change from nose to palate.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing that really stood out to me when I took a first sip of this, when I was making these notes, and still today, and power suggestion back to you, that pewter hip flask thing, it tastes like I'm drinking whiskey out of a hip flask, but it's not, it's from a glass. And that really confused me.
It's great. You know what this reminds me of is the two words we use to describe this is maritime and smoky. You know, I think that kind of speaks volumes to it. But I put this, we have a serve we call a Bloody Joseph, which is Bloody Mary, Bloody Joseph, and it works really, really well. But I put this in margaritas because it reminds me of a smoked mezcal.
Yeah.
You know, I'm
pepperiness
a big,
too,
yeah, 100%. So, but the funny thing is, you know, if someone came up to me in a bar and said, "Do you want a whiskey margarita?" I'm like, absolutely not. But if someone said Rock Island margarita, you know, it changes your perception.
Yeah.
Like, oh, that sounds pretty good. And it works really, really well. You know, I use agave syrup, lime juice. It's just, it works. If you get a chance to try it, go for it. But yeah, of course, Rock Island is the island's blended malts. We actually incorporate Islay into this. But otherwise, Jura, Arran, and Orkney would go into it.
And that was one of the questions that came up, is like the fact that Islay was as in there. And I pointed out to them that I believe, unless it's changed since last time I looked, the SWA doesn't recognize the islands as a separate region. So this is kind of the odd one out for the remarkable regional malts. This is the people's choice in effect, because we've kind of stood up and said, it's its own thing. We're vying for a revolution.
That's exactly how I describe it, as the odd man out, because it's the only one. You know, we talk about this traditional flavour profile of all the regions, but the islands is not recognised by the SWA as a whiskey making region at all. And partly, you know, not partly because like, any island whiskey is technically a Highland. It needs to be legally registered, not legally, as you know, but it is registered as a Highland.
There is one distillery that's below the lowland line, isn't there? I think, isn't Arran below lowlands?
Test me out. There must be a map in here.
Could be. Yeah, I know, right? I think there is one that's technically below the lowland line, but yeah, I don't know whether they count it.
I guess it depends where it sits in Arran, because if it's sitting on the coast, right on the coast, it could be a lowland, but if it's anywhere up that hill, then you know, onto plums. But yeah, the islands themselves have a very distinct flavour profile. You look at Highland Park, you look at Arran, Jura, like Chig as well, on Mull. It's obviously within Tobermory, but it's completely unique flavour profile. And you get Scapa as well up in Orkney, again producing a very unique flavour profile. They have their own unique one, but they're also quite diverse within themselves. But there's also, you know, if you look at the peated islands, you know, I love this talk about peat. You get different types of peat. You know, you can get peat from the Highlands, which is heather and flowers that's been semi-fossilized, whereas the peat from the islands is going to be salty and briny. So you get different types of peat smoke within whiskey, which is, again, that really brings into terroir and region. The islands are very unique, but we incorporate Islay to give it that peat kick.
Nice. Have you ever considered doing maybe you haven't, it just hasn't come to BC, like a smoky version of the Timorous Beastie? Because obviously there's a lot of peated highlands to work with.
We've not done one up until this point, and I probably wouldn't tell you anyway, but I don't think there are any plans to do a peated Timorous Beastie. The whiskey, the liquid itself, lends itself to different avenues, I would say. There's definitely other whiskies that we would consider doing with peat, but I don't think Timorous Beastie would be one of them at this moment. But, you know, whiskey's been around for hundreds of years. Never say never.
Yeah, fair enough. The reason I ask is for anyone watching from the local whiskey club right now, getting an exclusive here. We've recently started working a lot with Blackadder, with one of the only two places in the province that you can get Blackadder's whiskies. We've been quite familiar now with the Blackadder Red Snake series, which is their mystery single cask, apparently all from the same distillery, but they will never say where it's from. But they've just started coming out with a peated version of that, apparently from the same distillery, which is quite interesting. So they're not changing brands at all. They're just making peated Red Snake.
Nice.
Which I think they missed a trick. They should have gone White Snake.
Yeah, yeah. Have a contrast, yin yang.
Yeah, we could have all been singing along. It'd be great.
But yeah, so I adore that. I think Rock Island is, for me, it suits my palate perfectly. You know, and I when I do tastings of all 6 RRMs next to each other, some people love all of them, and then some people say, "Oh, I don't like that one. I don't like that one." And that's the idea behind them, is that they're completely different flavor profiles. They are illustrating each region of Scotland. So it's not about liking all of them, but understanding and appreciating them is a very different thing. You know, there's certain whiskies out there that I don't necessarily, well, let's say they don't suit my palate, but I respect and appreciate them. Because they're well-made whiskies. They're absolutely stunning in their own right. They just don't suit me as an individual. And that's it. Yeah.
And the time and time again, any time I go to a whiskey festival, the Douglas Laing Masterclass is one of the ones that I always hear amazing things from. Not necessarily. I mean, obviously the whiskey is always going to be fantastic. I mean, pretty much at any masterclass at any whiskey festival. But whiskey aside, the education and the experience of trying so many different styles in one masterclass.
Yeah, you know, as I said, you know, I've got all these whiskies behind me. You know, it is a learning curve. You know, when I went from working in India with Pernod Ricard's single malt portfolio, which are amazing whiskies, you know, you go from commercial bottlings that are amazing, you know, and I would never denounce anyone's whiskey. They're stunning whiskies. And then you go to working with 65 plus single casks and blended malts and limited editions. And, you know, as we talked about earlier, you've got Talisker in a sherry cask, Talisker in a hogshead, aged to completely different years themselves. And you're right. And my education just went through the roof in understanding how the spirit from that distillery works within these types of casks at these different ages. It was wild, and it's great. You know, I'm constantly learning every single day, and Fred, Karen, Chris, their knowledge is it's stunning. It's just amazing to have them in the same building and be able to not nip next door and say, here, and they answer you with such knowledge and experience. It's great. But I'm spoiled for choice. Spoiled for choice.
Excellent. All right, so moving on to the final whiskey, I mean, we have to end with where it all began, I guess, in terms of the remarkable regional malts, but a very special edition. Here are the tasting notes. You'll get a kick out of this name, I know. Let's see if I can actually do it right. Peaty Pipers picking pickled pears.
Fantastic. Yep, that's a nursery rhyme if I've heard one. The tongue twister.
Islay celebrates like no other place on earth, as the pipers packed their instruments and bandaged their wounds. Surrounded by the reek of the distillery's peat fires, they thought of the dozens of barbecues they marched past, and their stomachs began to grumble. Although the platter they ordered was adorned with some of the finest smoked meats and cheeses from around the country, the band members couldn't help but be drawn to the local distillery workers' homemade salted pickled pears.
Oh, so what was the title of that again?
Peaty Pipers picking pickled pears.
Nathan, love it. Absolutely love that. I just need to write that down. Yeah, nailed it. Absolutely nailed it. So this is Big Peat Feis 2020, which sadly didn't go ahead, unfortunately, this year, but we still mark the occasion with our annual Feis Big Peat bottling. So the name of this, you'll see, is A846, Islay A846, which is, of course, the famous road that runs through Islay, taking whiskey lovers all over. But the 846 is also part of the bottle. So we did an 8-year-old Big Peat at 46%. So the 8846, kind of a nod of the hat to that, because
nice. And as my girlfriend said, she came along to the tasting on Sunday, and her response to that was, "That's some Illuminati shit right there." That's brilliant.
The core 46% is the Big Peat bottling.
Yeah. The fun thing on that is, I don't know if you've realized that people have latched onto that 846 and started theorizing that the A also means that there's more Ardbeg in it.
Ah, all right, cool. I have not been told that, but
hey, if people want to believe that, then we'll let them believe it.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, you're correct.
Conspiracy theory whiskey.
Yeah, so 846, it just tied up quite nicely, but Big Peat, sooty and ashy is the way we describe it, and I think this is very resemblant to that. And having an 8-year-old Big Peat, Isla whiskies, I remember meeting a guy and he told me I only drink 18-year-old single malts. That's it, and older. But I love Isla peated whiskies. And I was like, well, no, you don't. He said, what do you mean? And I was like, well, an Isla whiskey is probably, if you like peaty Isla, the best years to have it, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11's pushing it. The best years to have an Isla peated whiskey, because it's something that's introduced at the distilling stage as opposed to the maturation stage. So the further that you are going to get away from the distilling section, the less peaty it becomes, and it changes. It becomes really beautiful. But if you like peaty whiskey, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years old is definitely prime time for that.
Absolutely. As we've just seen with, of course, Ardbeg's Wee Beastie actually sticking the big 5 right on there up front, which I think is a great move for the industry in general. Hopefully more people will follow on. That's actually one of the questions, of course, this being an 8-year-old edition of Big Peat. Do you see maybe down the line, once people get used to the idea that younger whiskey isn't worse whiskey, do you see the regular lineup having age statements on them?
They already do. If you don't know, we don't know about this. Yeah. No. Oh, it's exciting. Right, we got exclusive.
All right.
We have now finished with Epicurean and who was it? Timorous. Really bad if it's right. But we now have our official, consistent, aged versions of our remarkable regional malts. So we have our non-age statement core, and then we have our aged core versions of each of the remarkable regional malts. And it was Big Peat that finished off with Epicurean.
So it's not a replacement, it's an addition.
It's an addition. Nice. It's not a replacement. So we have our, I'm not sure if we've got them here. We've got our 10-year-old Rock Island behind me. That was one of the first editions. And this is going to be one of our consistent editions. It's the aged version.
Yeah, we've had that over here, but I assumed it was just a limited edition. It's nice to see that it's going to be a continuation.
It's going to be a continuation.
Very good. That's excellent news. I'm very happy. Yep. My day's off to a great start.
Fantastic. They're going to be an addition. So we're going to be seeing them more in specialist retailers, your aged editions. But yeah, the Big Peat Face Shield will always be something that we just want to do. Just bring it out.
And I love the creativity in the style every year, and in the story and the packaging every year as well. Although I don't know if you realize how many liquor stores you've annoyed with having a box this wide. Like, how's this going to fit on a shelf?
Guerrilla placement. We're here.
Although in fairness, this whiskey sold out at the tasting, so it never made it to the shelf anyway. So
did it not?
I don't have to worry.
Good. But one thing I love about Isla whiskies as a whole is this kind of color, and I've always seen it. With even Kalila commercial bottlings, there's got color in it. Isla whiskies have this lemongrass hay color in it, and I always think it's very much like a bumblebee flaunting its black and yellow, or a wasp saying danger. And Isla whiskies for me have always had that very distinctive color, especially younger ones, saying this is going to be peaty and oily. And the one thing I love about Big Peat, and I think it's very true for the Face Shield bottling, you take it on, the nose is very clean and organized, and again that lemon citrus I find, but on the palate you've got this chimney smoke, and which is a very controlled fire, and then as soon as you open your mouth and let a little bit of air in, it becomes this bonfire smoke of intense tar and licorice and just a wildfire, and then you start breathing it out. It completely changes from nose to palate to what I consider the final finish is the exhale. It completely changes to every 3 stage.
Nice. Yeah. So the regular edition of Big Peat obviously is famous for having a little bit of Port Ellen in it. Is that something that continues to all of the special editions, or is that not necessarily the case? I mean,
yeah, that continues
probably
to
like the 27. Oh yeah, even the 27 and the 33 would have a little bit of in.
Yeah, well, we have probably, the way we go through it, we're probably one of the largest collections of Port Ellen, original Port Ellen casks in Scotland. We've got a massive selection of it. So yeah, it's part of the core recipe, and it will go into every single bottling of Big Peat. Absolutely. If anyone has seen Fred at any form of tasting or festival, he's always got his own wee sample of Port Ellen. So if you're really nice to him doing it and don't bug him, he might bring it out. It just depends.
Do you reckon he'll let you bring it to Victoria?
That's exactly what I was thinking. I'm like, I'm just trying to play my cards right. It's just like, yeah, you know what? Take that 50 cl of Port Ellen. It would never make it to the festival. But yeah, it's the core ones: Ardbeg, Kalila, Bowmore, Port Ellen that go into Big Peat, and always will.
Nice. Yeah, and it's amazing to think actually that Big Peat is only 11 years old.
Yeah, 2009.
Yeah, it's taken on such a life of its own. Like it's got huge fan followings. We've got collectors here on the island that try and get one of every single edition that comes here to BC, which is great to see. I'm still campaigning to try and get a bottle of the really Big Peat as the bar whiskey, because the hotel's got a bar as well. That'd be kind of cool. You've got one back there.
I'm not going to bring it down.
No,
just in case. But yeah, we've got a really big Peat here.
It's something like 6 liters or something, isn't it? No,
4.5.
4.5. 4.5 liters. Mad. It's 6 bottles. That's right.
Yeah, I got my dad one, and before this was pre-COVID, and we were over and we were doing lean backs because it comes in its own wee cradle. So we're actually. So my mum came in, and yeah, me and my dad were pouring it for each other as we're leaning back. It's great. But yeah, 4.5 liters.
Yeah. So one question that came up is with Big Peat being the first and inspiring the whole line of the remarkable regional malts. It probably came up in conversation, but someone like, well, when they got to the Scallywag, why didn't they call it Wee Sherry or Big Sherry and have a sherry character? It'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, the Scallywag came about when I think Fred's told the story before, but it was Fred and Cara. They were in with the artists who created Big Peat, and I think they were doing a limited edition of it. And the artist was there, and Cooper, or actually Binks, on Scallywag, and actually missing a tooth. If you look at a Scallywag bottle, the dog is missing a tooth, and it's Binks.
Oh, really?
The artist just did a sketch. Yeah, so they're missing the left tooth. You'll see it. It's quite nice. The artist did a sketch of Binks sitting on the couch, and they absolutely loved it. And one of the reasons we call the Scallywag is that it was what way Fred referred to Binks was a bit of a scallywag. And that's how the name came about. We ran with it. So yeah, and then
so
there was no intention.
All the whiskey then.
Yeah, 100%. There was actually no intention to do the remarkable regional malts from each region. That wasn't the thought of doing Big Peat. It just came about. We did Scallywag, and like, a cheeky Scallywag, and did that. Thought, right, sherry. That's very common. So then that's where it kind of came to life. The whole series was, right, you do sherry Speyside. Great. Why don't we do a Lowlander? Why don't we do a Highlander? And then all these came about, and it just fell into place quite nicely.
So that brings us to the final question, which is very, very Canada-centric at the moment. Have you ever thought of branching out the remarkable regional malts and going outside of Scotland and doing a Canadian whiskey or an Irish whiskey or even a Japanese whiskey? Yeah,
this is something I personally would like to see, is especially with our old particular bottlings, is doing like a Paul John in India bottling of old particular. I think that'd be really cool to see. Again, it's one of those moments where nothing's in the plans just now, but it's never say never situation. With Douglas Laing, we do things wild all the time. We have absolutely no qualms about looking at different things and having those discussions. So 100% in the future we could look at it. But I think with the remarkable regional malts, unless we did cousins and further afield, I think that's a very cool idea. But we'll see what the future holds. But nothing's in the plan just now, but we'll see.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Great to do a Canadian cousin.
Not if, but when you come over for Victoria Whiskey Festival, I'll introduce you to Leon Webb and the guys up from Shelter Point, because I'm sure they'll be able to send some casks your way.
Yeah, that'd be great. Pro bono, right?
Yeah, maybe. I know they're really wanting to showcase their amazing whiskey in Scotland. It's remarkable good stuff that they're making up here. Leon actually apprenticed at Edward Hour before he came over here. He went to Heriot-Watt University and whatnot. And they're making a stunning Scottish style single malt over here. So I'll make sure I give you a couple of samples when you come over.
Yeah, I want to get away from my desk. I want to get away from my desk and go and travel. I want to get onto a flight soon.
How long have you been with Douglas Laing?
I've been with Douglas Laing since November last year.
So you didn't have much time working with them before the pandemic hit?
No, not at all. So yeah, it's been quite intense, and then figuring out new ways of working. So we traveled a little bit, but I had plans to come over to the Americas, North America, and do. I think we're going to do Canada and the US, and it just everything happened. We couldn't do it. It was annoying because I would have loved to have done it. I've visited Canada, I've visited the US, but I've not done it in a professional capacity. And I don't know, just going over and drinking whiskey and talking to people, like-minded people, just sounds great. And unfortunately, we just couldn't do it, which is a shame. But we will.
Excellent. I was actually planning on being in Scotland in May. Obviously, that never happened as well, because it's as sad as it sounds. Like I've been in the whiskey industry now for about 10 years. I've worked in distilleries in Australia. I obviously work here now in BC. And I lived in Edinburgh for about 4 years. And I've only ever been to one Scotch distillery, which is upsetting.
Really?
And that's
quite surprising. Not even that far.
Yeah. The most upsetting thing is I've been to Islay, but I didn't visit any distilleries. I was there for a folk music gig.
That's quite surprising, actually. I thought it would have been jumping or chapping in a bit. Well, next time you're over, hopefully we'll have Clutha up and running, so you can come and visit and come to the sample room and see what we can do.
I mean, I don't know how long the epidemic is going to go and how long Clutha's got, but if the timelines go to plan, that'd be great.
Fingers crossed.
At the very least, I want to come check out that tasting room.
Yeah, it'll be a very different setup when it's in Clutha, but you're welcome to drink as dry, so I don't have to carry it all over.
Beauty. All right. Well, thank you very, very much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I almost definitely got a parking ticket, but that's fine. I'm going to put up on the screen, if we have any bottles remaining by the time this video gets uploaded to YouTube, I'll put up on the screen what's available so that folks at home can check out our web store at strathliquor.com. And thank you very much to Stacey. She set this all up for us, and she's doing a fantastic job bringing all this whiskey into the country.
Thanks, Stacey.
And ladies and gentlemen, the great Stuart Baxter. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Pleasure, Adam. Thank you so much for having me.
Here's to whiskey kisses, the peaty taste of scent.